I'm Frank Yamada, the Executive Director of the Association of Theological Schools, and I welcome you to this important and timely webinar, Black Lives Matter, Where Do We Go From Here? Friends, we are in the middle of facing two pandemics, COVID-19 and systemic racism, which has contributed to consistent killing of Black people and persistent violence against communities of color. Unlike the coronavirus, systemic racism is far from novel or new. It is an evil that has been around for centuries. On May 25th of this year, George Floyd, a 46-year-old Black man, was killed by a white police officer in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The images caught on video sparked outrage and fueled protests first in Minneapolis, spreading across the globe. The goal of this webinar is to explore both the impact and theological work needed to address the consistent killings of Black people. This goal comes directly from a call to action that was issued in an open letter from Black presidents and deans at schools and departments of theology and religion on June 3rd, 2020. We have worked in consultation with the group who authored this letter, along with the African American presidents and deans at ATS schools who adopted this statement as their own, to create a two-part process to facilitate this discussion within the context of ATS's biennial meeting events. This webinar is part one of this two-part process. In this webinar, we will hear from leading voices among Black theologians who will speak to this theological work necessary to address the consistent killings of Black people. Part two, which is by invitation only to Chief Executive and Chief Academic Officers of the Association of Theological Schools, will be an open forum for the 2020 biennial meeting of the ATS on next Tuesday, June 23rd. In which the work of these panelists and respondents will be the starting point for the conversation. The open forum will also allow for school administrators to share and reflect on implications for their own schools while providing space to provide input to the ATS Board of Directors about how the association can address systemic racism through programs, initiatives, research, and engagement. These are only steps in a much longer march for ATS member schools to address systemic racism as it relates to schools' missions to provide theological education for a future generation of leaders and scholars. The call from the streets is clear. We must do more than talk. We must think about actions that can address the transformation of systems that historically sought to disadvantage Black people and to commit violence against communities of color. So this conversation is only a step. But I am grateful for this assembling of this august set of panelists and respondents who can share their wisdom as a key reference point for the theological work to be done to bring an end to the killing of Black people and can contribute to a society in which people of color can do more than survive or even live safely, but indeed thrive. One word about this webinar. This webinar is being live streamed on ATS's YouTube channel, and therefore will be made available to the public. And for those who would actually want to watch that stream live, you look for ATS COA, that is the ATS and Commission on Accrediting, the acronym ATS COA on YouTube, and it is now streaming live on our YouTube channel and will be made available to the public after this webinar. Let me introduce Mary Young, Director of Leadership Education, who will be moderating this webinar. Mary has been with ATS since 2017. She has done an excellent job of overseeing the professional development for administrators that make up much of the programmatic work of the association. She has also been instrumental as a colleague in the creation of this just-in-time webinar and open forum for the biannual meeting of the ATS. So Mary, I turn it over to you. And thank you for your attendance on this webinar.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you so much. And welcome to all of you who are joining us for the webinar today, Black Lives Matter, Where Do We Go From Here? Our guest, as Frank indicated, includes a group of a wide spectrum of leaders committed to both the church and the academy. And together they bring an arsenal of theological and practical perspectives related to our topic for today. For this webinar, as Frank indicated, we've been very intentional with gathering Black theologians who are panelists to speak broadly into the Black experience and to become the voices for the starting point of knowledge around this topic. We also have gathered a wonderfully mixed group of allies whose voices are critical for shared meaning making and strategy building. We welcome today our panelists, Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas, Dean of the Episcopal Divinity School at Union Theological Seminary, and Professor of Theology, Dr. Willie Jennings, Associate Professor of Systematic Theology and Africana Studies at Yale University Divinity School, Dr. Emily Towns, Dean and Carpenter Professor of Womanist Ethics and Society at Vanderbilt University Divinity School, and Dr. Stephen Ray, who's the president at Chicago Theological Seminary and president of the Society for the Study of Black Religion. Our respondents today includes Dr. Otis Moss III, senior pastor at the Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago, Dr. Elizabeth Conde Frazier, coordinator of relations with theological entities for the Association for Hispanic Theological Education, also known as IF. We welcome also Dr. Bo-Young Lee, Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs, Dean of the Faculty and Professor of Practical Theology at Aleph School of Theology, and Dr. Mark Young, President of Denver Seminary. Today's webinar design will include a 1-hour discussion with our panelists and respondents. Following their conversation, our colleague Debbie Jen will gather questions that have been posted in the Q&A portal from webinar attendees and will pose those questions to our guest. As a reminder, the chat function for this webinar has been disabled. We invite you to please enter your questions in the Q&A portal for the webinar. Following the event, as Frank indicated, this webinar will have been recorded and will be accessible at our ATS website and at our online engagement forum, Engage ATS. At this time, let us begin our discussion. Colleagues, over the last 2 weeks, the racial tension in this country has escalated, advancing to a volatile point with the recent killing of George Floyd. This has occurred even as religious leaders seek direction and guidance about how to minister during racially turbulent times. As theologians, academicians, and those whose vocations invite us to engage in faith-seeking understanding, the question is, what theological work needs to be done to address the killing of Black people? And at this time, I invite both Dr. Towns and Dr. Ray to begin our discussion.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Frank. I'd like to begin our time together with a few moments of silence in memory of the 9 members who were massacred at Mother Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church 5 years ago today. God, in your mercy, hear our prayer. When I first saw this question, I was somewhat baffled by it because the question assumes that the theology we tend to practice most days is designed to help answer the question. And the longer I'm in theological education and the longer I'm a person of faith that expresses it in Christianity, and the longer I'm Black and a woman, I'm not so sure that the theology that we have inherited is capable of answering this question. Because if it were, we would not still be doing it. And our churches would still not be sanctioning it or making excuses for why a Black person was killed for going to the corner store, being accused of forgery, sitting in their own home, and the list goes on. I mean, think about it. We can't even go to the park safely, the public park safely. So for me, the question is, where are we as theologians and ethicists and historians and pastoral caregivers and religious educators with a theology that I think is maybe inept at answering this hard question? How do you stop the killing of Black people? And let me also hasten to add brown people, poor people, lesbian, gay, bi, trans people. In other words, people that don't fit a white heteronormative box. So, do I sound angry? Yes. Do I have despair? No. That was not how I was raised. I was raised to always live my life in hope. So, what could we do to develop a theology that really does answer the question of senseless killing of people just because they may be different in some way than you or I? I think one of the ways that we can develop it is to stop talking. Stop talking and start listening to the gift of the diversities all amongst us. We tend to treat diversity as an issue or a problem or something to overcome. We have a mad rush to a sense of reconciliation, which in fact is not reconciliation. I think it's giving up on living into the richness of God's creation. So a theology, I think, that could answer the killing, the senseless killing, the mindless killing, the evil killing of Black voices, brown voices, all those voices, is a theology that listens to the gifts of creation God has given us, and then puts legs and feet to the actions we need to take to stop the senseless killing. I want to know why the students at Vanderbilt who show up at Legislative Plaza in Nashville are being beaten for nonviolent protest, and it doesn't make the papers. It doesn't get covered on the news. But I see their brown and Black bodies brutalized and bruised. That kind of theology that we've been taught has nothing more to say than, we need more. I turn it over to you, Stephen.
Dr. Ray, you are muted.
Try it again. There we go. I'm unmuted now. There are a couple of things I was thinking about. Certainly what an honor it is to be on this panel, and my appreciation for ATS putting this together. But then also there were a couple of things rolling around in my mind. I think what's at the root of the problem, at least from the perspective of church life, theological construction, et cetera, is the incapacity, and this may simply be a feature of people's humanity, but the incapacity to recognize and affirm that one's ancestors were moral monsters. The incapacity to be able to do that then leads to a project of rationalization that they couldn't have been monsters, so there must have been a reason why they engaged in the genocide of indigenous peoples. There must have been a reason that they engaged in the violence of slavery. And what that leads to and sort of constructs then is a structure of permission that presumes that violence against Black bodies and brown bodies is warranted in some way. that it's never an expression of simply the working of evil in the world. It's never an expression of simply malice taking flesh in the world. The presumption of denying that one's ancestors were moral monsters and the rationalizations that come from that lead to a posture that excuses because it presumes violence against Black bodies to be legitimate. And I mean, we see that playing out in every time we have these discussions. We see someone like George Floyd killed. Is the very first question raised by most, particularly white Americans, is what did he do? And if they find anything they can latch onto, even if it was a charge or a crime 10 years ago, which the officer who killed him knew nothing about, but it's because of that permission structure. And the second thing I began thinking about was what's germane to us in terms of the project that we are engaged in. And I really think that in theological education, we don't take seriously enough that theological traditions actually shape political actors in the world and shape the way that people are in the world. So even though it's clear to, if we begin to look at it, that violence against Black and brown bodies is occasioned by the fact that they are bodies. So it's a material issue, the materiality of our existence. So what that means is that religious traditions that circumscribe the importance of our bodily being are actually participating in that permission structure that I just described. And I think that one of the significant sorts of ways that we can, in terms of the work that we do, is be clear about how our traditions are shaping people to be political actors. Because if the problem is a permission structure that's grounded in materiality, because the only way you know someone is Black, at least in terms of people who shoot Black people, is because they look Black, right? You don't know anything else about them, you just know they look Black. So because it's an issue of materiality, it is necessarily an issue that cannot be dealt with in a theological system that makes the body subordinate to the soul. And so I think that a big part of what our challenge is to recognize, number one, that permission structure that's been created. And you can't deal with that as long as you continue to try to excuse the behaviors of people who were moral monsters. And you can't then begin to deal with the issue of the normalized violence against Black bodies if you continue to engage in reinscribing the theological imagination with a framework that makes the issues of the body subordinate to the matters of the soul.
Thank you both for your responses here. And I would invite our other two panelists, Dr. Jennings and Dr. Douglas, to also add to the conversation at this point if they'd like to jump in. All right, all right. At this point, we are very pleased to have 4 other leaders on as respondents, and I would invite any of them as well to jump into the conversation. Dr. Condi Frazier, Dr. Lee, and Dr. Moss, welcome. We're glad to have you. We'll give you time to get your breath. We realized you were coming from another meeting. And Dr. Young, Mark Young, please interview. Feel free to react to what you've heard from our panelists.
I think I will go. Thank you so much for this invitation, and also Dr. Towns and Dr. Ray, thank you so much. In terms of the structure that permits the killing of Black and brown people, I wonder, I agree with Dr. Ray that we have this theological education structure that is modeled after or studied with slave North Atlantic slave trade money to educate slaveholders' children, their leaders, and their ministers, and so whose interest that the higher education model that we are part of has been serving. And knowing that the original higher education of this country started with theological education to train their ministers. So I keep asking, if the structure has been problem from the beginning, what new structure can we come up with? What are liberating, decolonial, post-colonial, anti-racist theological education model or structure that we can come up with, which ATS also can play? And until we get there, what do we need to do in between? And in this point, I also totally appreciate what Dr. Towns said, that we need to stop talking and listen. Talking about what we do at ILIF, last academic year we just ended 2 weeks ago, we started a mandatory diversity training for faculty, staff, and the board. So like as our staff, 1 day a month, 9 to 4, with 2 trainers from outside, went through training every month. And our faculty also went through a similar but different training with Stephen Lewis. And our board also agreed to go through their own training, which is very much focused on all of our training is focused on how do we dismantle white privilege that is shaping theological education and worldviews. And also we revised the curriculum in 2018. So our students who used to take only 2 credit hour class on anti-white privilege, now they are going through their class for whole year, 6 credits. We just finished the first year of a 6 credit required class. Without finishing and passing and successfully passing the class, they can now move on to the next level. So I know, we are not even near to any perfection or anything, but we are trying to make efforts to dismantle this system until we have a totally brand new system. And talking about our faculty training, Stephen Lewis and our faculty quickly learned after the first day-long training that rather, we cannot just focus on curriculum matters and pedagogy matters, because we need to build a relationship to talk to each other, to listen to each other without bias, so that we can have a true conversation. So we spent entire year to develop relationships so that we can talk to each other. And so that training will continue next year with Dr. David Hooker, who is a leader in conflict transformation, so that we can have a really painful conversations we couldn't have, since we think we have a little better relationship. So this is just a tiny example of the moving toward the structure change and dismantling white supremacist worldviews. That is, that we, all of us, including us, are educated in the system. So my response is, what kind of a system can we come up together?
Thank you, Dr. Lee. You've raised a question to challenge us. If it's not this structure, what is the structure? And thank you for your comments. Other members of the responding team? Any comments?
If I may, I'd like to respond as well and say thank you for those very insightful observations. I want to pick up on what Dr. Towns said about the inadequacy, or the fact that the way we do theology or the way we have formulated theology isn't working. I wholeheartedly agree with that. It strikes me that in the part of the Christian faith that I've been nurtured in theologically, we tend to have a very historical understanding of ourselves, our own faith, and our theology. And that gives us then the privilege not to come to grips with what Dr. Ray was saying about the moral monstrosities that have been a part of our history. I like to think of it this way. We have what I call a flyover hermeneutic, where we think we could just read the Bible and then immediately live it out in our setting and fly over all the history, both good and atrocious, that has shaped the way we're reading that Bible. And so some of the theological work, I think, that needs to be done in the movement that I've been a part of is to come to grips with that lack in the way we think theologically and even the way we read scripture, and simply face how shaped and formed and nuanced and in almost every regard distorted our theological conclusions are if we don't take into deep consideration the history that we are a part of.
Thank you, Dr. Young. In the interest of time, I'd like to shift our conversation now to our second question for the day. In many ways, there is a systemic fuel that feeds the ongoing instances of Black people dying at the hands of law enforcement. To shine a light on this reality, the question is, what truth-telling needs to happen in the church and the academy? What truth-telling needs to happen in the church and the academy? And Dr. Douglas and Dr. Jennings will lead our discussion here.
Thank you, Mary, for that question. And thank you, ATS, for holding this conversation. And of course, it is always a privilege to be involved in these conversations with the other panelists and respondents. Let me see if I can begin to answer that question about truth-telling. I think that first of all, it is the responsibility of faith communities to lead the way to a more just future, right? That just future that God promises us all. Why do I believe it is faith communities' particular responsibility to do that? Because if we understand faith as being in partnership with God toward mending an unjust earth and moving us toward God's just future, then as communities of faith, we have by definition a responsibility to that just future and not to the present. That's who we are by definition. Now, what does that mean for seminaries and for theological institutions? I like to, oddly enough, brawl upon the old German theologian Karl Barth, who said that the role of theology, dogmatic says, the role of theology is to hold the church accountable to its faith claims. And so it seems to me that a primary role of theological institutions is to indeed hold our faith communities accountable to their very faith claims, the claims that they are faith communities with an accountability to a more just future. So now, how do we do that in a seminary, in a theological institution, and institutions that many people don't even know what goes on in them? That's our fault, not their fault, that they don't understand the relevance of theological institutions. Well, I think that the beginning of that starts with us leading the way in what it means to tell the truth. We must lead the nation in knowing what that looks like. And I like to call it in various ways sort of repentant truth-telling, or some way to frame that notion of truth-telling so that it's not simply mea culpa for the past and we just move on with the legacy of white supremacy, et cetera. It's not an apology, it's not an admission of guilt. It's the kind of truth-telling that then compels us to turn around and do something different, as we recognize not only the past, but our complicity in the legacy, right? But we first have to tell the truth about what that past is. We've got to talk about white supremacy and what undergirds white supremacy so that we understand it in all of its complexity, the kind of complexity that Dr. Towns was talking about that strikes out at those bodies that indeed don't conform to this notion of what I call Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism, that this notion of what it means to be a citizen. And that means that you're gonna be white and you're gonna be male and you're gonna be heterosexual. You're gonna fit in the mold of what we've described as American exceptionalism, right? And that's what feeds white supremacy. We gotta tell the truth about that. Now, theologically, that means that we have to tell the truth about the ways in which our theology has sustained and fostered white supremacist realities. Now, not simply in the most obvious ways, you know, when we can talk about religious racism and all of that, and then we can say, oh, those are exceptions, those are distortions of our Christian theological tradition. No, not simply in those ways which we could pass off as distortions, but we have to talk about the heart of our Christian theological tradition. We have to talk about these core theological claims that indeed foster and sustain the kind of white supremacist, exceptionalist kind of realities that strike out against bodies that are different, especially in the Black and brown bodies. So what are those core theological claims that we have to look critically at? Are monotheistic claims, right? There is a reason that Christianity has been able to sustain things like the discovery doctrine, that our whole notion of monotheism has also allowed us to be complicit and sustain the attacks upon Black and brown bodies, the realities that indeed they aren't sacred children of God, etc. I'm talking about core theological claims. Even, you know, when we think of sort of the Nicene tradition and what are those claims when we talk about sort of body soul splits that are core, germane to the way, as Dr. Towns says, our theology has not prepared us for a moment that perhaps in protest for a more just future, but what our Christian theology has done, that which is normative, has allowed for these kind of unjust white supremacist realities. We've got to tell the truth about that. And in our theological institutions, if we are not leading our students into critically engaging and looking at the ways in which core claims of Christian theology have indeed empowered a white supremacist theological imagination and allowed for people to unwittingly and unconsciously sustain these kind of white supremacist realities, then we aren't doing our job as a theological institution that is to push faith communities in leading the way to a more just future, because we aren't preparing students for that and we aren't doing it ourselves. Let me just say real quickly, so what do I mean by that? Because here's the thing, we know we can look at people who are overtly white supremacists and overtly racist and go, oh, and shake our head, but I'm not even talking about those people. I'm talking about the sort of good white Christians who indeed find themselves supporting. We know from research that white Christians support at a high level, majority of white Christians support protectionist policies, kind of Christian nationalism kind of policies. What leads to that? What's behind that? That they do that as good Christians. These monotheistic kind of claims. As research has shown us that when you put together whiteness and Christianity, something happens that distorts the humanity of people who happens to look like white Americans, and certainly perverts the Christian, the core of what it means to be Christian. And what is that core? We have to begin to reclaim. We have to reclaim what's at the center of our tradition in our theological institutions, have to tell the truth about what's at the center and reclaim it. Now, you know, it's interesting in the Christian faith tradition, we got two things that we don't live into. We're at the center is an incarnate God, right? You know, and so this sort of split between the body and soul, and bodies don't matter. Well, that means that indeed that's antithetical to the God that we claim to follow, right? The other thing that's at the center of our faith tradition is a daggone crucified Savior, a cross. And that ought to mean something. And if it doesn't mean anything else, it shows us that indeed God, in God's incarnate form, uncompromisingly entered into solidarity with the crucified classes of people of in this instance of Jesus' day. What does it mean to have those things at the center? And how is the theology that we have that has become normative within the Christian faith tradition indeed been a betrayal of that center? That's the truth that we have to tell in our theological institutions. And we've got to lead our students into critically engaging the core of our theological tradition and telling the truth about the ways in which it is sustained, not in the most obvious ways that we can call aberrant, but in those more subtle ways where we find the majority, particularly of white Christians, supporting what we can see as sort of white supremacists, unwittingly white supremacist notions of reality. I'll stop there.
Well, allow me to echo both my word of appreciation to Mary and to Frank and to the ATS for doing this, and also the appreciation for being with this wonderful group of panelists. I'd like to pick up on something that Dr. Douglas just stated so brilliantly in terms of the truth-telling we have to do at this crucial moment. You know, my hope that as everyone's listening into this, my hope is that the whole ATS family of schools will take very seriously this crisis moment and bring it deeply into the pedagogical imaginations of their schools. I'm aware, like everyone else is aware, that the ATS family of schools is a wide family with very different perspectives on many things. But at this crisis moment, my hope is that the entire family will understand that this is not a crisis just of policing, that something very serious is at stake for the pedagogical imaginations of what we do. But allow me to pick up on something that Dr. Douglas just stated so brilliantly, and that is the truth-telling we have to do that brings us to the heart of our faith. It is clear that in this country, there has been a profound refusal to enter into the revolutionary life of Jesus, the revolutionary life of love. That is clear. And I think the problem that we face is that we have become skilled in this country of becoming comfortable inside the distorted, contorted form of Christianity that we inhabit. One that is comfortable with death, one that is comfortable with violence, one that is comfortable with weapons, and one that is comfortable with greed. Now, the reality is that church and academy share in that comfort in all these realities. And the problem for us is that our entire pedagogical apparatus, our entire structure of education is built to increase our comfort with those three realities. We are the greatest producer of weapons in the world, in this country, and the church sleeps comfortably at night. We are the greatest progenitors of violence and the justifications, the intellectual and theological justifications for violence the world has ever seen, and the church sleeps well at night with that. We are in the midst of the most greedy country the world has ever seen. We baptize greed, and the church sleeps comfortably with that. Now, of course, why this is so important is because all these matters come to bear on Black and brown bodies daily. And so what it means for us is that the work we do, both in church and academy, is being done denying the very heart of the gospel. This country should see us together. as profound traitors. This country should treat all of us who call ourselves believers of any God. This country should see us all the way the FBI saw Martin King, as a dangerous subversive in our midst. And the fact that we don't function that way is a tremendous problem. The other piece of truth-telling we have to do has to do with whiteness. And I think this is crucial for us. The entire educational apparatus of the West is aimed toward cultivating white self-sufficient men, including theological education. And we are yet to come to grips with that very formation process. It is that formation process that thwarts so many of the good things we want to do, because at the end of the day, we still walk with the same image of an educated person, a person ready to lead, that has existed for the last 200 years. And the ATS and seminaries, divinity schools, we have to get serious about challenging the overarching image of what it means to form someone for leadership. Though that image itself is killing us. So I think we have to be honest about that. We all know that theological education has been at the heart of social uplift. It's been at the heart of moving up in class and in status. We know this. But the problem is that we have not sufficiently critiqued what that means for doubling down on the formation of whiteness itself. And so in our work, both in the church and in the academy, we have to think very carefully about what it means to form people toward the life of Jesus and not toward being some really strong, powerful white guy.
Thank you both. We have been tremendously challenged through your words. Dr. Moss and Dr. Conde Frazier, both of you work very closely with the church community and preparing persons to serve that community. I would invite the two of you to provide the response to what you've heard from Jennings and Douglas. Dr. Conde Frazier, if you would begin.
So we've talked about structure, we've talked about content, and we mentioned accountability. Then there's the project of what that theology is going to look like. And what we need, where I have found that people can bring all of these pieces together, because we can have projects, people can hear something and, get inspired to have some project, but that doesn't mean that the spirit behind that project has changed. That doesn't mean that the culture, the mentality that we have has really changed. We're doing something because it looks good right now, because it's the politically right thing to do right now. But that doesn't mean that the fullness of the structure of the grounding out of which it comes has really changed. And so that has been my challenge as an educator and as one leading in a structure, is how do we help that to change? And the issue of comfort is key. No one's going to be comfortable. No one is going to be comfortable if we're moving toward that type of change and accountability that we have been speaking about here. So we have to get used to conflict as a way of breaking up the ground upon which this grounding, these roots are apart. You have to break up the ground to pull up some of these roots, you see? And that breaking up of the ground makes people very, very uncomfortable. And it brings their anger toward you, and it brings many other pieces toward you. And we have to be able to have each other's backs, a structure that has each other's back when that takes place. And so what I have found in teaching is that when I go for that, I ask students to be reflecting. One of the most important pieces is, Emily mentioned it, we have to listen to the realities of our lives. The listening piece of the realities of our lives, of the things that we thought we saw on the screen, on the TV, but we can't really believe it because it's, you know, it's on the screen, it's removed from who we are. Even when you read the historical pieces of the moral monstrosities, we remove ourselves from it. Yeah? We remove ourselves from it. That comfort piece we're very guarded. Huh? I have a frozen shoulder, and in order to get deep into those muscles, what has happened is that I have muscles that are guarding the muscles that are frozen. And so in order to get into them, you have to get to those guarding pieces, right? And that's a deep, deep work and much exercise to make that happen. And the same thing happens. We can hear all of these pieces. Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas has mentioned a wonderful critique that we need to do of our theology. But people can hear that. That doesn't mean they listen to that. Yeah? That doesn't mean that they truly are in a place where what they have heard has brought them to a place of digging it up and coming to a different space. And so the continuous reflection, that there's a lot of different places of coming to that, of breaking up that ground, right? And so you have the content, you have the place where I always ask students in the doing of theology, there is no way that they walk away with just library work. They have to be able to do something right now in the community that they're in. And if they're not in a community, they're about to find one. For them to work with that community, reflect with that community, and come to a different space. And what they do can't just be something that looks nice. It has to be something that comes very directly from what they have read. I make them to read pieces that are very uncomfortable, where they cry, where they fight with me. But I always have an altar at which at the end, guided by the Holy Spirit, we sort of bring those pieces and we live with those pieces, because we have to be able to hold each other, to live with those pieces until the work, the deep down work, has been done in us as a community. And that begins to model something else. And so they have to write what I call an intellectual reflection. And that is engaging the readings with their present life, with what they have heard in the discussion of the lives of others. And that's not an easy piece to do. I had a young man who, you know, when you give it to me at the middle of the year, you can fold pages over that you don't want me to read because they're too private. I had a young man who gave it to me and he didn't want me to read anything. He just wanted me to know that he had written something and he didn't want me to read anything. When he got to the end, he had experienced a change through listening to the lives of others, people who kept bringing up these very uncomfortable things, listening in the readings to uncomfortable pieces, until finally something in him broke. And then he allowed me to read it. He brought it to me in trembling. And he says, you can read this. It was hate, hate, hate. Page after page after page of hate. And then there came a place where that hate broke. Because he was able to finally, after being bombarded from all of these different spaces, he finally was able to break. After having to come to that altar and having to live with that peace, week after week that we had a class. I didn't just, easily resolve the piece and we're done with this chapter and that's it and we move on. But the content can't just be what you read. The content can't just be what you find in a library. It has to be an engaging piece that makes you engage yourself personally. I can't talk about a moral monster out in history. I have to find out that it lives in me right now. The potential of it lives in me right now. I have engaged, as Willie Jennings just said to us, I engage every day in these pieces. And what does that mean for me? If I am going to be a follower of Christ, if I am going to be a faithful person in whatever faith it is, because sometimes we have persons of different faiths and we have to engage that interfaith reality. But there isn't a religious text that doesn't speak to our being able to have a revolution of love, that doesn't speak to those values. And then we have to construct something together, because that's what brings the imagination to moving toward another space. We have to construct something together, and we have to ask each other, does this construction go deep enough? Why are you constructing it this way? Are we letting each other off the hook when we do this? And we have to be able to use our different languages. We have persons who speak different languages, and we found that we created a glossary of words that are much deeper in other languages to deal with the moral monstrosities that we have. Because yes, even in language, we have to have language to speak about these things. And sometimes English doesn't have enough, because the English language doesn't speak as deeply about relationships. And if we're going to create a revolution of love, you need words that speak more deeply about relationships. And we borrowed each other's languages and spoke about what this was. And we had a glossary in class about what this means. But then that wasn't enough, because it was only happening in my classroom. And so I figured, you know what? Things don't happen in faculty meetings. They happen when I go to your office. They happen when I go to your office and I tell you how deeply disturbed I am about something that you said, about the implications that it had. That's the truth telling. How uncomfortable. People saw me coming to their office and I was like, oh, Jesus, here she comes again. Damn, what's this woman going to tell me now? Right? And so I made it a point not just to come when it was like that. And so it was a surprise if I did, sort of come that way. And I had to have different approaches so that you would let me in, But we had to have those conversations. I took you to lunch with money that I didn't have. Hello, I was the assistant professor at that time. So I took you to lunch with money that I didn't have, but I had that conversation while your mouth was full so that you had to listen. And little by little, from those conversations, then people really began to listen. And from listening that way, then we begin to have emails. And I say, you got to write the email. I can't write that email. They're going to write me off. I'm the crazy Latina that they have here. They've never had one before. They've never tenured one before. So you have to speak to that. And then you have to use all those white old men, their faces up on the walls, and find out what their legacy has been. And you have to go there and move from those places. And people then begin to feel like, okay, wait a minute, like this is serious. Like this is about moving and shaking some of these foundations. And so emails begin to happen, and now you have a buzz. And then you begin to bring agendas to the table. Because you know what? I'm done with sensitivity trainings. They're wonderful. I'm glad that Bouillon has found a way to make people listen. I think that the community building that you did is very important if people are going to really have something happen from a space like that. But people are so guarded that they know how to do these sensitivity pieces, right? But it doesn't necessarily go anywhere. And so you have to begin to bother people to go to different offices and so on and so forth. So when I left, that's the big test. What stayed? And I had a colleague who called me up 3 years later and said, you know what? People are still asking, what would Elizabeth say? Well, that's an important piece, because now they have internalized their voice. If they have to listen so much that they have finally internalized something from each other, from how we imagine things. Don't just tell me something that is just what I call pregnant birds, right? In Spanish, we talk about pajarito preñado. Anybody could come up with an idea. Anybody could do that. But the reason why birds don't get pregnant is because they crash and burn. They can't fly that way. So don't talk to me about pregnant birds, because those ideas aren't going to fly. Talk to me about what it is that we are going to do together. The creative collaboration that comes as the second part of the shur of repentance, right? Don't just tell me how sorry you are. Zacchaeus wasn't just sorry. The brother went out in the street and he gave back all the money and then some. So talk to me about that part as well. And then we need those reflective pieces. It's coming from, it's a bombardment from a lot of different sides. When you have something so deeply rooted, it's very difficult. You even need a bulldozer to bring that up. And so the truth telling has to come from a lot of different spaces, but you're opening up that ground in order to create something new. And what is it? From that truth telling, something new has to be engendrado, it has to be begotten.
Dr. Conde Frazier, you've gone to preaching now. Thank you so much. We do want to hear from Dr. Moss related to this matter as well.
Thank you. It is a delight to be on this webinar with everybody, and I thank you all for inviting me to have conversation with such an incredible group of individuals, and who I have great respect and love for. This idea of truth telling, and I so appreciate that idea being brought forth, and what theological and church examination, education, illumination should be. And if I may use a popular reference, a movie reference to really get at what I think is one of the great challenges. There's a film series everybody's probably familiar with known as Star Wars. And Star Wars has two particular groups, Jedis and the Empire. The Jedis are kind of the priests. They are the priests, essentially, that run around in the film, and they're supposed to be the heroes and sheroes of the film. And then there is the Empire, which is attempting to control everything. And originally, when George Lucas created the film, it was to be a critique on America's involvement in the Vietnam War. And the Empire was to be America, and the Jedis were literally to be the Viet Cong. That was the concept of the film. And in reflecting on that, the challenge for the church, the challenge for theological education, is we have an empire structure with Jedi desires. So we are chaplains for the empire, but yet we may have some Jedi language that speaks about how to liberate, but we are still stuck within a model that reinforces, as Dr. Douglas and Dr. Jennings already talked about, reinforces white supremacy. It reinforces an imagination, a racialized imagination in particular ways. And there has to be a reimagining. We've had these conversations before, a reimagining of what theological education looks like. Years ago, I had the opportunity to travel with my father to South Africa. It was not too long after the break within apartheid, and we were visiting schools. We had the opportunity to visit the University of South Africa and had this wonderful conversation with a professor. And the education, as they were conceiving of it, is they were raising the question of democratization. And this professor recorded his lecture on a cassette tape. And somebody drove it 800 miles to a rural area where 300 students stood around a cassette tape to hear the lecture. Because the question is how do we reimagine an apartheid education to democratize it in a way, in a new structure? Because the current structure was, you must come to Johannesburg or Pretoria or to the Cape, and you must be sequestered for 3 years in order to receive your education, then go out into the world and do great work. So they realized that the entire structure was designed to maintain apartheid. And if we are honest, we have an apartheid education and church structure that leans into this false notion of respectability and respectability politics, that we have to reimagine what it even looks like. So for the person who desires some type of education in connection with someone who has spent time theologically reflecting, the gateway is for some so high. So if I have an associate's, can I enter into the school? Some say no. If I have not, if I just have a GED, can I get this theological education? And we have to figure out ways that begin to critique our empire structure with our Jedi desires. And so we have this continual structure that keeps saying no, no, no. And we don't have partnerships with a larger community that is desiring the connectivity with people who have spent time raising questions and critiquing and looking at different notions of what it means to be fully human. So I use an example in terms of this, that the largest group of folk who are praising God are not Methodists, Anglican, Baptists, they're Pentecostals. But yet we have not built a structure to engage the global South and look at the Africanization of Christianity on one level, but at the same time, it is also being ripped from the hearts of so many people who have this Pentecostal proclivity, because there is a very capitalistic framework being pressed on a global movement of Pentecostals across the world. Theological education has a huge opportunity and a responsibility to break down particular barriers so that people can learn. Let me give you another example. So Stanford has something called the Design Lab. I was very fascinated in this. Like, what is the Design Lab? It's a year program where they bring together a philosopher, an educator, an engineer, an architect to talk about a particular issue. And I raised the question, well, do they ever bring anybody from a theological framework? I said, no, that's too controversial. That's something that we don't necessarily raise any questions about. So they are thinking through a non-traditional education to think through particular issues around design thinking. Theological education is going to have to begin to use that framework, the framework of community organizing, the framework of restorative justice circles. It's going to have to be a new pedagogy of how we even think to do education. The buildings are nice. I'm not shooting down buildings, but the real education for me never happened in the building. It was in the relationship with individuals. It was where, when people sent me into the street to build other relationships, and all of a sudden the theological education came alive in reference to that. The same thing must be taught within the church. And that is part of the beauty of the pandemic. If you find something beautiful, all of a sudden people are reimagining what church is. And so, I use Trinity as an example. It's for the first time we actually got a chance to we said, oh, we're going to make movies now, since we're online, so that we're going to do something different, because this crisis caused us to utilize our imagination, break down the empire thinking so that we could lean into our Jedi notions. We have to come up with a way in where we can begin to break down the empire notions. But the interesting thing in all the movies, that the empire always comes back, the empire always shows up, and there's always a fight between the Jedis and the empire. It is continual. You don't get rid of it. You just have to be in the fight. You have to know that you're leaning into something. And as the great Yoda said, you've got to know the suffering that is happening that will destroy you in the process. And so I believe that is how theological education is going to have to begin to reconceive. This virus has given us an opportunity. We are protesting in ways globally where people are recognizing Black anguish across the globe. This has never happened. 10,000 people in Perth, Australia, led by Aboriginals, mostly white, young people are saying Black Lives Matter. On a bombed out building in Syria, there is a graffiti artist who did an incredible picture of George Floyd that said, "No, say no to racism." We have a global movement that was kicked off by queer Black women. We have to rethink the way that we are doing theological education and become a part of the zeitgeist that is happening globally so that we can prepare people not to preach and be able to recite church history. That's nothing wrong with that, but to be able to be in the midst, to lean into Jedi desires so that we can break down the empire. And every time we have a victory, trust me, they're going to try and rebuild the Death Star every episode. But we've got to make sure that we are fighting and preparing people so that they will be able to lean into this moment in history. This is a unique moment and a unique opportunity for theological education.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moss, and for each of you, the contributions you've made. As usual, we are running out of time. We are up against time, but you've already begun to delve into this third question that we have. That is, are there particular ways that the church and the academy can partner so that they educate leaders and begin to strategize, particularly around the justice issues related to the killing of Black and brown people. And you've already begun to build a foundation for that. Let me invite you, all of you, to add any additional responses to that question. That is, are there particular ways that the church and the academy can partner, particularly around issues of strategy and leadership to prepare people as they understand how to fight this systemic impact of the killing of Black and brown people? Please feel free to add anything you like.
One thing I'd like to jump in just for a quick sec, Mary. I think one of the ways we could do that is by recognizing and accepting that the curriculums that we have are very much like Dr. Moss suggested, structured for empire. So for instance, there are 3 superb theologians who've written books that were award-winning on white Christianity and the problems therein, that did wonderful analyses. Neither one of them has been able to get a job because people couldn't quite see where they fit in the curriculum. And so that was the wrong question, right? If you take seriously that we are reproducing the lethal kinds of presumptions that create lethal situations, then maybe it's that we need them to help us rethink what our curriculum is. So I think, you know, what that is not begin with the question, will something fit our curriculum, but ask the question, does our curriculum need to continue to perpetuate these theological traditions and mindsets that creates what I described earlier as the structure of permission for violence against Black bodies?
As a member, as a person who worships at an Asian American church, especially this George Floyd killing, I was also deeply troubled by Asian American officers standing next to his colleague and doing nothing. And something is absolutely wrong with that picture, that they're not doing anything as you are watching. So as I worship at an Asian American church, I think, I keep thinking, we should really retell the history of Asian Americans in this country, because many of us are immigrants. We erase out the capitalism and slavery that was from the beginning of this country's foundation, as if we are here, we have nothing to do with it. But if we think about the name itself, Asia, where we are from, that label given to us by Europeans, by their standard. That is colonial agenda. And second, also, when British Empire's slave law, slavery was outlawed in 1833, still the British, quote unquote, the coolie trade accelerated, and which this continent colony was a major market. So at the bottom of this, this racially hierarchical society, there's Indians and Chinese, quote unquote, according to empire language, contracted laborers were next to enslaved people. And so Asian Americans need to learn that history and own the history. And we have been part of the system for a long time. So my, responsibility as a Christian or some clergy of Asian American church is we need to relearn our own history in this country.
Friends, it appears that, oh, Mark, I apologize. Go right ahead.
Okay, thank you. I think in our setting, the seminary has a unique opportunity to be a place where you can have conversations that many pastors would feel are dangerous in their own congregations, where you can talk about issues with one another, with colleagues and peers, but you may find intense resistance from your parishioners for those conversations. Maybe just one quick example. A pastor recently shared with me that after urging his congregation to pray for justice in the Ahmaud Arbery murder, he received an email from one of the leaders in his church, lay leaders in his church, saying, why didn't you ask us to pray against the conspiracy to take down the president? Now, imagine this person, these folks trying to pastor a congregation that has such wide disparities of views. They really don't have a safe place, even sometimes among their staff. So as a seminary, we can be a convener of conversations, and we can have those conversations in ways that allow those who would feel threatened in their own settings to speak up and to share and lament and grieve, and perhaps find some encouragement from colleagues as well.
Thank you both, Dr. Lee and Dr. Young. You both have raised issues of grave concern, and particularly, Mark, is leaders might not always have safe spaces to talk about issues of justice. And thank you all for your comments. We are ready now to shift to our questions that might have come as the discussion went on. And I'll ask Debbie Jin if she will now lead us to that part of our time for today.
Great, thank you, Mary, and thank you, panelists. It's just been a very rich information that you have given to us. I am recognizing the time. We've got about 14 minutes left, and what I thought I'd do is we've got a number of questions that have come through that are within a certain category, and then another category. So I'm going to pose both questions at the same time and just let you all, whichever one you seem to resonate more or have a better response to, and let you decide which one you're going to do. So one is more theologically based, and then the other is more practically based. Not that those are, they're not mutually exclusive. So the one that I'm considering that's more theological or more philosophical is, so there were a number of questions that came through related to white privilege, white supremacy, white fragility, and kind of the question of how can we change that model and how can we address this, the empire model if the theological underpinnings really continue to privilege the white group. So the very specific question that's more theologically oriented is, what about the fundamental theological premise that says darkness is evil and light is salvation? So if you could kind of give some reflections on that. The second question is, can you provide an example of how your organization has addressed racial injustice? And I'm talking about on the ground examples. We've heard a bit from Dr. Lee, from Dr. Condi Fraser and Dr. Young, but wanting to hear from some of the rest of you, what are the on the ground examples of a different theological model, or just naming some of your language, challenging the images of normal, whatever normal is, formation, or maybe aligning that empire structure with Jedi theology. So what are some of those practical ways that your organization has addressed those racial injustices?
In terms of the second question, one of the first things I did within 2 months of joining the organization is to hire someone who is a director of development and director of strategic partnerships, whose entire portfolio is working with the Black community in Chicago. And I paid that person at the top rate that was available in his department, because what I come to realize is that the battle of racial injustice is not in the classroom, it's in the boardroom and the development office, because at the end of the day, those are the two offices that will have the most impact on the shape of what the curriculum looks like. So, I mean, I think that's one of the things that certainly I've done concretely, because not only am I touching those two places, but once a school actually builds creative relationships where they come to believe that a part of their substance is their relationship to the Black community beyond simply tuition dollars, then you can actually begin to do the kind of lasting curricular change that's not just ephemeral and attaches itself to certain people who happen to be on faculty.
Let me try to jump in and answer that first question, that theological category. As you put it, how can we change the model if under the underpinnings is a kind of theological foundation that supports white supremacist structure, et cetera. First, let's say two things. One, we have to begin to reimagine, redefine, understand more broadly and differently what theology is. Because we have thought about theology, first of all, in ways that indeed sustain, suborn, consciously or unconsciously, the unjust structures, and inevitably lead to the support of those structures, whether it's through silence or doing other kind of things that don't, in fact, get us into the places where the cross calls us. And so how do we begin to redefine theology? If we think of theology as faith, seeking understanding, even if we think of theology as God talking about God or Word of God, how, when we talk about faith, seeking understanding, or God talk, we talk about that in terms of intellectual activity, but that's not where theology starts. That's not where our faith lives. We don't sit down one day and say, I have nothing better to do, so let me think some theological thought about God. I wonder what God's goodness looks like. That's not why when we do theology. We don't do theology when everything is good, when our faith is just going along. No, we do theology when there is a contradiction of our faith. And we've got to begin again to allow people to broaden this notion of theology. Theology doesn't start up here. It starts where faith is lived out. And so I think we have to reclaim what theology is, bring it alive, because it is alive, it is dynamic. Because why is it alive and why is it dynamic? Because God's alive and dynamic, and we are people of faith who are constantly trying to partner with God toward a more just earth. And so if we began to talk about theology in that way, the other thing that I will say, and so I'm just hitting these things very quickly, is that we need to change. We talk about our curriculums. what comes into the center, what change the voices that come to the center of our theological curriculum. Now, if indeed we believe that the center of our faith is a crucified Jesus, then why is it that that which is coming to the center of our theological curriculum are the theologies that indeed reflect crucifying realities, or support and suborn crucifying realities, as opposed to the theologies that are reflective of the crucified classes of people? Those theologies have to come to the center of our theological curriculums, and we know that they don't, because we know that they become the add-ons, or the, oh yes, we need to think about this, these theological perspectives. Those perspectives should begin to come to the center. I say this, we talk about, you know, our theological underpinnings having suborned white supremacy. Yes, that which has become normative has, but that's not the only theology. That's not the only Christian theology that has been born, right? And we have not recognized that, because we have invalidated that in so many respects as not the core, not what theology is. I think about, and I'll end with this, a quote. I think about James Baldwin, who once said, of course, there comes a time in the life of every Black American when they must face the shock that the flag to which they have pledged allegiance has not pledged allegiance to them. There comes also a time, I think we're at that time, where we face the shock, particularly people of color, the oppressed, that the daggone faith traditions that we have pledged our allegiance to have not pledged allegiance to us. It's not God, it's this faith tradition that has become normative. But here's the thing. When our forebears faced that shock, they didn't face that shock. They knew automatically that this isn't about the God of Jesus. And so, informed by African religious heritage, born out of the hush harbors, as we like to say, is this narrative that resisted the kind of theology that has now become the center of our theological curriculums. They resisted that and said, no, that's not who Jesus is. That's not who the God of Jesus is. And so they gave birth to a different theological tradition that has been moved to the outskirts of our theological curriculum. And if this movement doesn't teach us anything else, it teaches us that those voices have to come back to the center. And for a Christian faith tradition, it's not an option. It has to come back to the center because the crucified Jesus is at the center. And so that's where our theology, I think, needs to begin. And that needs to be the way in which we began to reshape our theological curriculums.
Thank you, Dr. Brown Douglas and Dr. Ray. Is there anybody else who can respond for another minute or so? I do have to leave a couple minutes at the end for our executive director.
If I can just add a couple of thoughts to what Dr. Douglas has just said so wonderfully. We have reached a moment where I think we have to help people rethink the spiritual disciplines, especially those folk who have been shaped profoundly to always reach for racial comfort and racial safety. There's a crucial matter in front of us, that for so many people shaped to be white in this world, looking for a place of safety and comfort drives so much of their spiritual life, and drives so much of the way in which the spiritual life of their Christianity is shaped. And so we need to rethink a spiritual discipline that doesn't move away from the anguish and the pain of this reality. And we also need to think through a spiritual discipline that will sustain us all together in this crucial moment. Like so many others, I am surrounded and working with so many people who are fighting off unrelenting melancholy right now. And so how to think the faith in the face of all this despair is not, it should not be an individual endeavor. It must be corporate in a new way. But I want to see these two things joined. I want to see a conversation about spiritual disciplines that moves away from white comfort, that says to so many people, you can no longer look for comfort, racial comfort, but also says to all of us that there's a way that we can share and move through this moment of anguish and despair together.
Thank you for your responses to these questions. We were not able to get to very few of them, actually, only a few of them, but I do want to lob it over to Frank Yamada.
Thank you, friends. I don't know how you bring something like this to conclusion. I don't think it requires an punctuation. In some ways, maybe it's an ellipsis, because this is a step for all of us. But I did want to just bring a few summarizing comments. I'll be very brief here. What I've heard all of this is really a wisdom panel that we've convened to be able to address. I've heard the addressing of structures, of curricula, of spiritual disciplines, about how the entire system of higher education and theological education within that, how those are supported and by the structures of empire, even with the language of the Jedi on our lips and in our texts. And I've heard about how we can affect institutions by making strategic decisions that will put the focus on Black communities. So Dr. Ray and his strategic hiring of the critical role of someone in the development office and in community engagement. Also heard coming to the center of the theological curriculum of these voices that have always been in syllabi, the last pages of the syllabi. But I think what really is one of the intentions of this webinar, recognizing that that this is a webinar that has been about theological work that we need to do, is that in some ways one of the purposes was to ground the next stage of the conversation as this panel being the central text from which conversation can emerge. So we're recentering the conversation by starting with these wonderful reflections. I also heard, I did want to also recognize something, and this is something that I've heard from many folks of color, scholars of color, administrators of color, and faculty of color, recognizing that this does represent a cultural tax, and this is the problem of the system. It is very appropriate that this become the core text from which we emerge into the next stage of the conversation. And it represents a cultural tax on these administrators and leaders who are currently leading their institutions through, in some cases, unprecedented changes to address this twin pandemic. So we need to recognize that, and I need to recognize that as the executive director of ATS, that I was in some ways the one who called for this tax. And that is a representation of the system and the way that the institution tends to work. And I hear this as well, the hope that the ATS schools, and this was Dr. Jennings' words, will take seriously the crisis of this moment. And that was certainly what the call was in this open letter, and that we're hoping at least that was heard in very rich theological ways among the panelists. And the speaking that has begun, but hopefully, as Dr. Towns named also, hopefully this is also where the listening is beginning to happen at a deeper level. And this is where the listening can begin, in places where we can do this truth-telling, as we heard from Dr. Douglas and from Dr. Jennings as well. So friends, thank you again for a rich conversation. And again, also with the idea that this is the first stage of a two-stage process, at least for this round of biennial events within the ATS. This is the starting place of the core curriculum, so to speak, for the next stage of our conversation. But also recognizing that the next stage, we are going to actually be asking leaders to be thinking about steps of action that they can take within their own schools, steps of action that they can ask from the ATS board to be thinking about in terms of what resources, what programs, what research can help facilitate the work that schools need to do to dismantle systemic racism, to not just prevent the killing of Black people. That should be the bare minimum, but to create environments where people of color and communities of color can thrive. So thank you, friends and colleagues, for this wonderful conversation. Thank you to those of you who have been listening attentively, and we apologize that we cannot get to all of the rich questions were put in the Q&A feed. But again, and to those who will watch on the YouTube channel after this, take, listen, learn, act. And so thank you very much again for your participation in this webinar from the Association of Theological Schools.
Thank you, friends. Thank you so much for attending and participating.